All right. So thank you all for joining us here in Keene, and for those of you online, we're coming to you live from the Andrews Center in beautiful Keene, New Hampshire. It is really refreshing weather up here. Thank you. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started with the depth of the panel today. First, if you're watching online and you'd like to enable closed captions or language access, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen. Just know that there will be a 30-second delay throughout the panel as you do that. And then in addition, if you need to use the restroom, and if you're in the audience, the bathrooms are alcohol and to the left. So, but I am really excited to be here today with a wonderful panel of experts. And someday we'll figure out the But we're really excited to be here with you today. I'm Melissa Roberts Chapman. I'm here representing an organization called the Federation of American Scientists, which is an organization that works to develop practical policies that help bring great ideas into reality in the policy realm. And wanted to take a few moments to start out by letting each of our panelists here today give a short, 3 to 5 minute introduction of you and work.
Hi everybody, my name is Basil Starbush. In case you can tell by the suit and needle pad, I'm a lawyer. I run a small firm in Paris, Texas, with a mission of building stronger towns from the inside out. Basically, we work on 3 things. On the one hand, we work with small businesses and small developers in rural communities. On the other hand, we work with local governments to help them reform their land use regulations and their economic development programs so that they support small businesses and developers. And finally, we work with advocacy organizations focused on rural communities, particularly in the area of anti-monopoly policy. We think that's a really important part of why rural communities have struggles and a big part of the solution for reinvigorating a lot of rural communities. So excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you for having me.
My name is Matt Dunn, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Center on Rural Innovation. We are headquartered over in Portland, Vermont. That way. And we work with communities all across the country to help build tech economies in rural places. Since 2008, there was a massive divide between urban and rural areas. You can trace back a huge portion of that to the forces of automation that created millions of jobs and removed millions of jobs. The problem is it almost exclusively created them in urban places, focused on the fruits of automation, software, robotics, those kinds of companies, and new companies, so companies less than 10 years of age, and almost exclusively remove jobs in rural places as traditional rural economies, manufacturing, farming, extraction, all automated super fast. So we are committed to helping make sure that rural places are able to own some of that emerging economy that is taking off and is growing very quickly and provides superb jobs. We do capacity building with those communities. We don't own and operate innovation hubs. We have now in our Rural Innovation Network 33 communities across 24 states and 4 time zones, and continuing to expand. We also help with broadband for those who are pre-broadband. That's obviously critical to being able to have a tech economy, and we have a seed investment hub that focuses exclusively on investing in rural tech companies so they can grow.
Hi everyone, okay good, the mic works. So my name is Liz Helly. It's so good to be back here. I used to live in Keene quite a few years ago now, and it's amazing to see how it's changed in all sorts of positive ways since then. I currently live not too far from here in Plymouth, New Hampshire. I'm a planner and designer at a small rural consulting business, called Resilience Planning and Design. And we work with communities and organizations throughout the Northeast to essentially help them plan and collaborate with them to create vibrant and resilient and inclusive places, ultimately. And we do that through utilizing land use policy and regulations, helping them think through strategically planning for infrastructure investment, and also brainstorming potential creative projects that might involve multiple, stakeholders and partners in the community to accomplish, but that could make a positive impact and help them meet their goals. One very small anecdote I want to just share is that on my way here last night, I was on Route 202 and 9, and if anyone knows that route, there's no service almost the whole way. And I stopped at a mobile gas station, and I ended up accidentally locking my key in my car. And my phone's in my car, and I'm talking to the gas station attendant inside, who's super nice. It happened to be in Stoddard, and I'm trying to figure out local state police department and who can I contact to help. And before I even had a chance to enter a more panic state, the gas station attendant was like, "Oh, Mike, the mechanic right down the road is coming. He's gonna help you get your key open and out of your car." And I was like, this is why I love working with rural communities. This is what the people are what make any place special. But I thought it was such a great example of why this small town atmosphere and small town ecosystem, for lack of better words, is such a unique, just such a unique thing. So I'm happy to be with you all today talking about entrepreneurship and rural community development.
Awesome. So the region that we have in front of us today to talk about is really entrepreneurship policy and how that is relevant in rural communities. But if you start to think about, what's a policy level intervention, I think we're really talking about a number of different systems. We're talking about the legal system, we're talking about the community development system, the planning system, design system. And so, as we talk about policy today, we may sometimes be talking about legal policy or legislative policy, but I think in a larger sense, what we're really talking about in this conversation is a set of rules and norms, including laws that govern how we act. So, with this incredible group of people who work in rural development, I know when you're pegged as an expert, sometimes it can be hard to do things like change your mind as you see the world changing around you. And, this is a time in our world where certainly things are changing. So my first question for each of you, as folks who have done this work for many years, is, what's one thing that you knew for sure about rural development that was true 5 years ago? You changed your mind on since, and how did that evolution come about for you?
Okay, I'll pick it up. I had so many answers come to me when I heard this question before the session. So I'll try to keep my answer short to just a couple of big points. What we've seen in working with the towns and cities that we partner with on projects throughout the Northeast is in the last 5 years, we're in a really different type of climate, both physically as well as within our communities. We're seeing many more communities interested and mobilizing actively towards addressing big issues like climate change, like housing, and even related to equity and inclusion. More and more towns, cities, municipalities that we're working with are invested in integrating that equity lens into their community development and planning processes and projects and programs, and looking at who's served by these opportunities that we're creating, who's not served, who's able to access the benefits that are associated with those programs and who's not. And we're also seeing a huge shift, especially in rural communities. We've seen cities take advantage and be interested in the arts and creative economy sector, but more and more rural towns are seeing that they also have a place and a potential environment for that activity to happen. And not only that, but like some of the additional placemaking, look that movement, I guess, that's been happening throughout the country is really related to that. So how can we kind of create opportunities for creative businesses to, set up shop in a community and have a high quality of life in their place, but also how can local governments play a role in building on some of those efforts by, integrating public art and, stimulating kind of more public creative expression in that way. So those are some of the kind of bigger movements that we've been seeing infiltrate our work in a really positive way with rural communities.
Awesome. So, and that is we start our quick request from the virtual feed, put the mic up real close to your mouth.
Very close. Yes. And we're going to help Liz get a key magnet for her car so that won't happen again. And go under the thing. Anyway, so I'd say there's two things. You asked sort of two questions. What was a surprise and what has changed? And the surprise that we had, or that I had, was how much the narrative that rural people can't do certain things had sunk into the psyches of rural leaders. I knew that wasn't going to be the case. I knew we were going to have to make the case to urban folks who believed that all of rural America was the same, that rural America was white America, that rural America was not aspirational and all that. But what was fascinating was the insecurity we ran into with communities that had a whole bunch going for them already. And that and that's why our creating a network of communities that are working on building tech economies, the kinds of things that they've been told over and over again, oh no, you can't do that, was so powerful. Because they were able to see communities like them, people like them in different parts of the country actually succeeding, and were able to do it. But it was just a much bigger narrative play than I was ready to be all kinds of righteous with the Silicon Valleys and the urban folks who just have never spent any time with them. The other piece that I would say was a huge shift over the last 5 years was what came on during the pandemic, which was horrific in 1,000 different ways, but it changed the aperture of where work can happen and where investment can take place. And it's been pretty profound. And the impact has changed a little bit our place-based approach, where we were trying to create technology communities in these rural places. And then when people could all work remotely, it meant more folks who were technologists moving to those places, but not necessarily a recognition that you could create that universe. So the importance of spaces like this, co-work spaces, that can create a sense of community became much more important. But it's been a really interesting shift. We don't believe that Zoom Town is community. And it's really important to understand that you're not going to get a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts if you aren't creating places and spaces for that collaboration, for that virtuous collision to take place as you're doing it. But it also carried through to investment. I mean, a really interesting statistic is that in 2017, of all of the venture capital in the world or in the US, only $3 billion went to rural zip codes. By 2021, that was less than 0.5%. By 2021, it had grown to over 40 billion and 2.5%. Now, 2.5% is certainly not equity, right? Rural America represents 13% of the nation's workforce. But that is a huge jump, and it was year over year over year. It wasn't just suddenly something that jumped up. So something's going on, and I think it's an exciting moment to be thinking about the changes that rural places can have, especially since the other big changes happened is that the federal government actually believed and took action on funding broadband in America in the way that should have been done 30 years ago. And it's an exciting moment that they're looking at it like rural electrification, and that's going to create even more opportunities for rural places to be on a level playing field.
Yeah, I would say, you know, from my world, what I think the thing that changed and the thing that I learned more about. Sorry, I thought there was a problem with the mic. The thing that changed and the thing that I feel like I learned more about over the last 5-10 years or so is that we used to think that, you know, the reason lots of people left rural communities and lots of businesses agglomerated in larger cities is, you know, just the market forces, that it's just sort of like a natural process, and that policy is really about controlling the side effects of that natural process. I think what we're seeing now, you know, groups like Farm Action or American Economic Liberties Project, is that, you know, a new element of the conversation is how law and policy structure these dynamics. So, you know, a good example of that, I would say is, you know, historically we used to have policies in place that make sure that, you know, family farms could make a decent living. We sort of had it in policy in various ways that we want families to be able to have, you know, we want the average size of farms to be about 250 acres. You can see this like going back to the early 1800s with how we structured land ownership and land sales to sort of make sure that small freeholders were a big part of local communities. That logic went away in, you know, from the mid-century onward, but we're sort of recapturing it and starting to think again about, you know, how can we structure the economy, you know, at the federal or state level so that business isn't consolidated in larger communities and larger cities, and smaller outfits and smaller towns can tend to local needs and grow that way and build ecosystems out of that. So.
Awesome. I'll let you turn on to it. So as we get into the next question, you know, the thing that strikes me about what all of you said is just how complex and complicated and deep these issues are. And so as our understanding of them changes over time, you know, it's really hard to find the solutions. And I think as human beings everywhere, when we find a solution that is complex or complicated, it's our natural tendency to want to simplify it and to apply, you know, a technical or a simple or a linear solution to what might be, you know, a complicated or a political, cultural, exponential problem. So my question, or I guess series of questions since you called me out that, for all of you are, you know, what are some technical solutions that you all see in your area of work that you think are overused, and what might a different approach to solving these same problems look like?
No.
Let me make sure I understand. So what is a technical solution that's overused?
Yeah.
I think, well, let me frame it in a slightly different way, because I think there are lots and lots of things that need to happen in order, to your point, in order for these communities to be successful. The part that we have struggled a little bit to break through with, and then it becomes clear, is that the way that we've been doing economic development in rural places has been broken for a while. Right? For the last 30, 40 years, the entire directive for an economic development director is to somehow convince multinational corporations to land a plant or operation in their deeply subsidized industrial park, throwing as many tax credits as you can possibly manage at them, and public dollars for infrastructure and everything else, and then have to continue to pile that on so that they would deign to stay year after year after year. And it creates some short-term gain. It creates a lot less gain as automation has accelerated. In fact, I've heard story after story about businesses who have gotten even recent dollars to help them be more competitive by giving them huge amounts of capital so that they can automate, which usually results in having or removing 2/3 of their workforce with a multinational corporation. So not even the benefits and net wealth that's coming out of that enhanced efficiency is coming to that community. And so that's been interesting. But the other side is not understanding that for a rural community to be successful, it has to be functioning in the tradable economy. It has to be importing cash and exporting value. I remember talking to a person from the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and someone had suggested that the way we were going to solve, rural community problems is just having more farmers markets. And he sat back and he said, well, you'd have to have someone who paid $4 for a tomato. And everything became quite quiet. And he said, and it's not going to be me. And it's real, right? We need to make sure that we have beautiful communities that have awesome downtowns and a lot going on. But you also have to have businesses, ideally locally owned businesses, new enterprises that are coming up that are involved in national or global economies to be able to bring in that kind of capital to make sure that a community can be successful. You want to tighten up value chains. You want to make sure that you're not having extractive practices. It's kind of crazy to have people who are doing logging, shipping their logs all the way up to Canada to be processed, only to be shipped all the way back to be sold to folks building houses. But you also need to be supporting enterprises that can really function in a national and global marketplace, which is where our work fits in as a niche piece. People don't want to live there. If it doesn't have things going on, it's not going to work. But you need to have that other part as well to be able to support all of those activities. I would say it's the practices of economic development that's at one extreme or the other extreme and there's not a lot of focus on that in between piece of creating new enterprises that can bring real revenue and jobs and opportunities into these communities that have unbelievable potential and innovation.
Yeah, I'll make a point that sort of dovetails with what Matt was saying. In general, I think the tool that is overused is subsidy, just generally. In many ways, the sort of poster child for bad subsidy is, traction subsidies for large corporations. But in many ways, we also often think about supporting local, small businesses in terms of different forms of subsidy. And that has an important role to play. I'm not knocking it. But on the other hand, I do think in many ways we don't think about the more structural reasons that small businesses can't participate in the trade economy, can't participate in the day-to-day industries that we all use. So, if you think about grocery, right? I think there's, what I've heard is that like when Walmart was started in the town it started in, there were like 3 or 4 other grocery stores in a tiny, tiny town. And the reason that was the case, a big part of it anyways, is that you had a law called the Robinson-Patman Act at the federal level that made sure that retailers, chain retailers like the A&P back in the day, some of you may have heard of it, that they couldn't extract, these really low prices from suppliers, unless it was tied to efficiency of production. So that meant that they couldn't use their bargaining power
to get an unfairly low price from a supplier that a small business couldn't get. And that made it possible for a small grocery chain, or a smaller grocery chain to compete on service, to compete on selection, on quality of goods, etc. But since the 70s, since the 80s, we've sort of stopped enforcing that law. And so like you go talk to any given retail local business and they'll tell you, we can't compete on price with chains. And so that means that, that really closes the door to small businesses for, participating in retail and commodity industries where it's not a niche, it's not, a giant new innovation. And, a big part of, if we want, communities that are vibrant, we need to be able to, restructure markets, restructure competition so that it's fair and so that small businesses can participate in a full range of industries and not just, be dependent on subsidies or be dependent on outside support.
So one of the tactic solutions that we often employ with communities that we work with is updating and amending land use regulations to both retain the character of their community, what they love about it, what makes it special, what's familiar in a lot of ways, but also where and how to guide development activity, what that's going to look like. And oftentimes we see towns, especially smaller towns, largely due to capacity issues and sometimes just not having the resources to launch a more comprehensive effort prior to this. But oftentimes we'll see them take a more piecemeal approach, updating land use regulations to try to get more housing in a particular area, to try to spur a particular type of commercial development at a particular type of density. And while some of these kind of more like precise interventions can be helpful and can actually yield positive benefits, we, in our experience, our firm's experience at least, we see taking the time to build that kind of foundation, that common vision for how do you see yourself? How does the community see itself? Who are you now? Where do you want to go in the future? What do you want to protect and maintain? And where do you want to see growth and change happen? And so I just wanted to kind of articulate that. It was one of the things I thought about with this question coming here today, was just how important that building a common vision that can be supported by property owners and business owners and families and elderly and children and all of the different people who live in a community, who all have their own unique sets of values and honestly valuable opinions to bring to the table about what future growth should look like and what future economic development should look like. We shouldn't, pretend that these conversations should happen in a silo with people who are only have the expertise to make decisions on them. That's absurd. These are decisions that impact our communities. And we all have something to bring to the table to affect the direction of those. The last thing I wanted to say on the land use regulation front is that this is, I guess, more related to the other half of the question. It's not really overused per se, but it's a common perception, is that in many small communities that we work with, we see this perception of no land use regulations as a way to get business growth in a community. And we're seeing that there are incredible limitations to the way that we develop zoning and land use policy. I mean, I just say zoning and land use policy, and I, who do this as a job, want to it's very it's not super attractive to a lot of people, and we make it so. We the legalese language, no offense, and I've written the legalese language too with ordinances and things like that. Oftentimes it's hard to navigate, but there's a reason why, and there are actual and perceived limitations from people who are navigating the regulatory process that are like, I can do this and I can't do that. That's annoying and frustrating for me. So there's some actual realities there. However, in our industry, we also see how clear and flexible land use regulations, dynamic land use regulations, can offer a sense of predictability, and it can be utilized as a tool. Oftentimes we'll see small business owners that are coming in to apply for a regulatory process for a community that has regulations that are more based on form, building form, rather than use, more based on, rather than limiting the number of parking spaces, looking at kind of taking a much overarching kind of view of like, all right, how can we meet your needs while also making sure that the character of this particular area is maintained, having it be more conversational, having there be opportunities for, I don't want to use the word loopholes, but exceptions and things like that. That process can be a really effective tool if they're designed well. So I just want, that's one thing that we try to educate the communities that we work with, is that it actually can provide, oftentimes business owners and people who are entrepreneurial are excited to see a vision for the future that a community has, especially if it aligns with theirs, and see that there's regulations that are in place to support that vision. Like, oh, you want me there, you're gonna help me to get there, you're gonna help me to navigate the process. And hopefully it creates a win-win situation if that conversation is effective and we're not just hitting roadblocks every step of the way.
Awesome. So I'm going to take just a moment and go pass the mic back down and go to the live feed to see if we have any questions.
This is a question from Mason. He said, how do we preserve Zoom towns that have a lot of natural assets that attract remote workers? And what can we do to get them to engage in the community, even if their employer is elsewhere?
Oh, I'm sorry, how do we prevent Zoom towns?
So as I mentioned before, I do think this is a moment where we can place entities like the Hannah Grimes Center on the front of what the new economic development drivers can be, and the next generation of community developers. Because the hardest part for a while was getting people to feel like they could actually live in a rural place and have an aspirational job. Well, the pandemic and the investment in broadband is sort of solving for that, but we've now got to get back to the idea of a commons, the idea of bringing people together. And that you can't expect those kinds of enterprises in rural places to be profitable. I just want to be clear about that, right? It's not, and that's been true for a long time in rural places, right? There's always been a notion of a commons, a shared space, a shared place where you can actually go and work and socialize and connect together. And that's now taking the shape of how do you allow for people who have atomized types of employment. So they're working for a company that could be anywhere in the world, or like some of my employees that could be also living in Heartland, Vermont, and are choosing not to come join me in the office, right? So these are real things. But if you can create that space and the kinds of events in the tech world, as tech meetups or Linux user groups or hackathons or pitch competitions, you can bring that community together. And you can do that with other kinds of programming that can come from having co-work spaces and innovation spaces in places where people can come together and create that aggregation. You can't expect it every day. I think we're beyond that now. But you can expect it as something that you can earn to create an environment where people want to be together. Because it is lonely working out of the spare bedroom at Dirt Road, right? That is not something that I think is sustainable for everyone forever. But there is a way to be able to create that new work. On a policy side, that means that some of the infrastructure programs that are meant to invest in economic development infrastructure needs to see that as economic development infrastructure. And unfortunately, it sometimes happens, federal policies take a while to catch up to that, and they're still funded hand over fist extending water and sewer lines to prime ag land so it can become an industrial park, right? And that's where all the money is going. Instead of understanding that there is a new way to do this, to create that value, create that connections, and then have the whole of folks who are working remotely be greater than the sum of the parts.
So I think, addressing the problem of like preventing Zoom towns is part and parcel of addressing the problem of atomization generally, and isolation generally, both in the workplace and in social life. And, I think in terms of, on the policy side, sort of what a lot of local governments could potentially do about that is look at how they do civic engagement now. We have a lot of laws, open meeting laws, and sunshine laws at the state level from the 70s and 80s that are very well intentioned, and sort of the way they structure public input is by, if you're trying to do something, once you have the policy, then you have to do a public hearing and gather public input. And that tends to be, a process that attracts the most invested people, often people who are opposed. It also tends to be a process where the input isn't particularly useful, because, people often complain about things about a policy that are sort of individual to them or that are idiosyncratic. But, a better approach would be to do civic engagement in the sense of, asking people what are your problems, right, before you develop the policy. And, trying to restructure those laws so that they don't impose those back-end burdens so that local governments can embrace, front-end burden of constant outreach would be really interesting. I will say one more thing on that front, just as an example. Just in my anti-monopoly work, we do outreach to local businesses about different monopoly problems and connect them with national advocates who are working on those problems. And what I notice is that, if you ask local restaurants about their distributors, they will drop whatever they're doing and talk to you for 45 minutes. And then they'd be willing to write a testimonial or an affidavit to send to the Federal Trade Commission. And then they'd be willing to participate in a call and everything. And so what I'm trying to say is asking people about the problems that they're facing in business, in work, can yield a lot of engagement in and of itself from people and build community in a different way, in a better way, and sort of break that isolation and atomization that we deal with, I think, especially in rural communities.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo everything that you were just saying. I totally agree. I think in terms of the civic engagement process, especially as it relates to policy, is super, super limiting, prohibitive for a lot of people to get involved in, and turns a lot of people away almost at the gate. Whether it's Robert's Rules of Order in a meeting, or it's such a baseline starting point for conduct and making decisions about these types of things. And I just couldn't agree with you more. I think that there needs to be so much more iterative community engagement that's authentic, and really focused on having meaningful conversations and dialogue about the stuff that matters to people in that particular place. And while we see that there's going to be really similar answers, depending on a particular community's unique geography and just unique characteristics, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's brought up that is particular to them. And I completely agree. I think that the civic engagement piece is a really big part of this.
Awesome. So in our last couple of minutes, I want to turn to all of you. Does anyone have a question for the panel that you'd like to ask, especially one that lends itself to a short answer since we're getting close to the end of time?
This is a long-winded panel.
They're big problems. Yeah. No, okay, well, I'll go ahead then and take the privilege of the last question. So in a very brief answer for each of you, which is really hard to do big issues. What's an example of what totally disruptive thinking would look like? Like if you, in your wildest dreams, imagine the thing that you think could change to do rural development better at a policy level or systems level, what would that look like?
Okay, short answer. So to me, it's not being afraid of big, bold, and creative ideas, and not being afraid of change. I think there's a perception that rural communities are resistant to change. Some of that is true. Everyone knows the cranky neighbor down the road who doesn't want to see anything change ever. You may love them, you may not, but they're there. And I think that acknowledging, I think many of us know on an individual level that change is probably the only constant that exists, and that we have the ability to articulate and shape the change that we want to see, that we actually have the power, and if we can be empowered by that, I see a really bright future for all of us.
I would say the one thing is thinking about the structure of markets versus subsidizing markets. Not just at the federal level, this applies at the local level. If you think about land use, for example, if your land use process requires someone who wants to add a unit to a house and make it a duplex to go through a year-long approval process full of risk and difficulty, then you're restricting who can enter that market, and it becomes that only someone who's larger, has more financing, can take that risk and can embrace that process. So if you want to encourage development, something you could do is, instead of subsidizing it, rewriting regulations so that they promote market entry. That doesn't mean take them away. It just means thinking about, what kind of market you're creating by the regulations you're imposing.
If the federal and state governments invested as much money as they did in training and support of manufacturing into new tech economy jobs in rural places, including and making sure that that's inclusive, so that you're actually providing opportunities for folks who have non-traditional education backgrounds, which has been proven over and over again, can take tech jobs and run with them and thrive, we would see a transformed economy and equilibrium in the country. And the other thing that would be pretty disruptive, which would be pretty powerful, is if you took the cap off of H-1B visas for rural micropolitan areas, you could see a transformation both in terms of diversity, perspective, and entrepreneurship that could take off.
Awesome. Oh yeah, one more idea.
I'll just add one more thing. Less an idea, more of a comment about something historical that could be useful. This isn't the first time we've been here in terms of the disparity between rural communities and urban communities. In the 20s and early 30s, we had the same thing develop. My angle on this is anti-monopoly, so a big part of it was that we passed these great laws in 1914 and then forgot about them for antitrust. And we saw lots of consolidation that made rural communities into colonies of the industrialized large cities. And we fixed that in the 30s. We changed, we started enforcing those laws. And, that led to a period of rejuvenation in rural communities between the 40s and the 70s. And I think we can do it again.
Awesome. Well, thanks to all of you for a wonderful panel. Thanks to all of you for being great audience members. I know we'll all be around here for the rest of the day and probably tomorrow as well. We'd love to connect. Thanks to all of you watching online for your great questions. Enjoy the rest of the day. So for folks online and looking today, we're going to get set up for the next panel, which is coming. It's going to talk about things a little more of a grassroots level. unless a policy system level, so stay with us. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna try that again. Good afternoon. All right, and that's so that you wake up after the afternoon lull, so we can definitely check in with each other and make sure we're feeling energetic. It's also a great time of the day to thank our event organizers. Having put on events for the larger part of my career, I'll say how much work goes on behind the scenes, so I just wanted to give a round of applause. And thank you to the campus leadership team for inviting us all and getting us together. I think it's really pull together something special. My name is Kristen Lutz, and I come from not that far away, down the road in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'm very honored to be here as what I consider a grassroots community builder, and somebody trying to change a lot of what's going on in the world of philanthropy these days. So I sit in my work at the intersection of people, places, and minds. And so hopefully, as we get into this conversation today, we can make this interactive, because I'd love for you to be walking out of the room, hearing and learning about things that you really want to know about, and also recognizing you may have something to tell us that could help us with our daily work. So I will introduce our amazing panelists here. We'll get going with our questions, but we want to be sure to leave time to chop it up with you a little bit. So I'll get started by saying right here, we have Jeff Murphy, a Keene native. Jeff and his wife partner Eliza own a constellation of companies, which sounds so beautiful, based out of a dynamic, multifunctional, revitalized industrial building on Emerald Street. They'll tell you how to get there after this. Brewbaker's Cafe is the brick and mortar restaurant, and the community house is the early 90s. Terra Nova Coffee is the organic coffee roaster, and wholesale accounts all over the Northeast, as well as online retail sales nationwide. And finally, as if that were not enough, Nova Arts is their events performance space, bringing artists from all over the country and sometimes beyond together. And then we have here also Jane Pesh, the planner for the city of Muskegon, and he will tell you exactly where that is. As a true Michigander, probably using his hand. Yep. Excellent. And Jane is a lifelong resident of Muskegon and has worked as a planner and urban designer in the city for the past 5 years. He holds a bachelor's in architecture from the University of Michigan's Tallman School of Architecture and urban planning, and his interests are in history, strength, and potential of Rust Belt cities and towns, and that drives his work and dedication to his hometown. And then Leanne Seiler, hey, Leanne, way down there, the Southwest Region Manager at Network Kansas. A rural entrepreneur herself, Leanne brings a unique perspective, gained from 15 years of boots on the ground as the Economic Development and Tourism Director for rural Western Kansas. She is passionate about creating destinations, bringing the creativity and energy of young people to Main Street. She's a mom, a grandma, lucky her, and a maker, and is rural by choice. So those are our panelists, and I'll just say quickly about my work. I'm a co-founder and co-owner of Plumbing Collective. We are a diverse group of people trying to help the nonprofit sector make our jobs better. So better human practices, better people stuff. So this will be all about people today and grassroots engagement. So let's kick it off and kind of run through some of the questions that we had. We had a great preparatory call. And we thought a little bit about this term of ecosystem builder and how that can sometimes put people at arm's length
And so I was interested to just quickly hear from each of you how you define your work as a grassroots community builder. And by doing that, just tell me a little slice of like, what would you say you spend 50% or more of your time actually doing? And does it relate to that sense of grassroots community building? So you can take it out first.
Absolutely. So my grassroots ecosystem building is something that's been sort of ingrained in my life. I look at it through a values lens, growing up in this community where my daily is interacting with, my close circle of my ownership team, my employees, my customers, my vendors, outward into my wholesale community, which is in the New England region. We have sort of cousin shops around New England and grocery stores and markets, all the way up to the sort of diaspora from a lot of our online customers. We can track from, this people used to come to Keene on vacation, or they grew up here and they brought coffee to their cousins. So this sort of diaspora that goes out into the rest of the country. And then relating to our sort of music booking, and I've spent 20 years as a touring musician. So a lot of my connections have to do with venues all over the Northeast and the East Coast. And so we have these connections up and down where we route musicians through our little corner of New Hampshire because we know it's a good strategic spot. So we have these various different webs of ecosystems that we're engaged in. Much of my work, I say more than 50% of my work is really just communicating and networking and just seeing how it all sort of plays together. So it's happened from a little seed, but now it's this sort of like wide web of ecosystem.
Yeah, so I think when you asked that question, I was kind of confused as to what ecosystem might mean. And the more I thought about it, in my role as a local government city planner, I realized that it was more, my role was to set the stage for those ecosystems to exist. And that is done often through land use regulations and things like that, but sometimes we break the mold. And in this team, we did a project called Western Market. We call them small retail chalets, but they're more or less garden sheds, if you can imagine that. And we placed them right on our main street in downtown Muskegon, and basically open it up to local entrepreneurs to apply, move in, and operate their storefronts out of there. And it definitely does not follow the typical trajectory of land use planning or all that, but it sort of breaks that mold and just sets the stage for those people to move into an environment where they wouldn't typically have a place and literally give them a physical space to operate out of. And from there, they sort of took over and made that ecosystem themselves and just regulate it, so to speak, but really it was just providing a framework for them to build that kind of environment for themselves.
I'm trying to remember your exact question. What was in about 50% of our time doing that? For the past 15 years, I would say I spent at least 50%, probably 90% of my time just listening to businesses and entrepreneurs, listening to city councils and county commissioners, trying to figure out what everybody wanted and trying to find a happy medium or that gray area where people could come together and agree on things. In my new position, I haven't been there very long, but since July, but I honestly think I might do the same thing. I'm now considered a community coach for Southwest Kansas. And so I go, make visits to different economic development directors and groups, find out what it is that we can help them with Network Kansas, what resources we can provide them with. And honestly, just try to be the person that I needed when I started economic development. Because, you start out fresh and you got all these meetings and it's a whole different language. Everybody uses all the acronyms and things that you don't know right off, and to find out the people that know information, that know about the resources, they assume everybody knows about it. And so I think probably just listening is probably 90% of my job.
Thanks. So I'm just going to reflect back some of the things I heard. I am definitely thinking about coordination, listening, and providing physical spaces where people can get down to business and do what they have to do. And so I think a lot of us that support entrepreneurs will want to see more entrepreneurship in our towns. This is a big part of what we do, and I think Sarah said best when she was describing what is done here at this center. It's kind of like, well, I just kind of collect people when you come in the door and show them that I care and ask them what they need. And so, when I'm in a space like that in my community, it's very similar. I think that act of welcoming a care community that's created around and for entrepreneurs, and then putting some of your technical superpowers to work. And so when we think about that, there's another element, and research will bear this out, is trust. That actually when we think about getting stuff done together, trust is actually the most important ingredient. So for, you don't have to answer the policy, but please tell us a little bit about examples of trust building in your community, things that you've seen work, or maybe that have eroded trust that we wouldn't want to repeat. So let's talk a little bit about trust.
Yeah, I think in my world, I think about trust a lot with our performance booking. So we like to support local performance. We also like to bring performers in from all over the country to our stage. And what we found is that it's a trust building exercise. So when we bring in somebody who's never been to our stage, their performer, it's just as important how we treat them, how their experience is, as to how much money they get at the end of the night, or how many people show up at the show, because that experience that performer has is what they relay back to the booking agents, to their people that they've met along the tour. And that just sort of builds the pathways, strengthens the pathways for other folks to want to come through. So showing respect helps to build trust, and that trust kind of builds this sort of a snowball effect where good things really start happening when you build that trust.
So I think this is a little more of a big picture approach in my instance. In my own time, I do a lot of research on my hometown, and in the 1970s, we basically demolished 9 square blocks of the part of downtown Muskegon for a shopping mall. It was a government subsidized urban renewal project, and this is my great example of how not to build trust. People still today recall that old downtown, they're nostalgic about it. Generations of families knew that place, and their entire lives were built around the stores that they may have owned down there. And all at once, everybody was basically evicted, more or less, and sort of scattered to anywhere within the region. So sort of those large, big approaches to redevelopment, I think, are great ways not to build trust and great ways to more or less blow up those ecosystems that once existed. So for somebody of my age, I never saw that version in Muskegon. I would hear about it from others and read about it in the newspapers, things like that. But what we find ourselves dealing with now, and sort of the idea behind the Western market, was to start to rebuild that ecosystem and build up some of that trust and get downtown Muskegon back to the place that it may once have been.
I think that building trust is a lot like being married. When you first get married, you love this person, but 30 years later, after you've been through everything you've been through, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different level of trust. And so spending time with people, understanding the issues that they have, working through them with them, being an entrepreneur yourself actually sometimes helps because you understand, how hard it is sometimes. Does everybody have we have a bike across in Kansas, where they start on bicycles at one side of the state and ride them across the state. Well, when they come through your town, it's like locusts. I mean, everything in its path is gone, food especially. And we love it when they come. But when they came one time through Jetmar, I don't remember how many bikes there were, maybe 1,000 bicycles. I spent my day washing dishes for all of the local restaurants because, everybody was serving food as fast as they could. They didn't have enough help. There wasn't enough room in the kitchen. So I went from place to place to place trying to help them get caught up with dishes. And that's not one of the things you think about when you think about economic development, but it was one of the things they needed at the time. And I think that's another important thing. We remember that when we get together. It's like, oh yeah, you helped me on that horrible, awful day. So I think that's another important part, just being there.
I love that story because that really is the true example of being in a relationship with people. And I think when the next question, we talk about our unique strengths in rural communities. And in fact, I think somebody brought up on the panel call, well, everybody knows everybody in town. Most of us live in towns maybe like that. So let's talk about some of our unique strengths. Maybe trust and ability to sit with and know people is a strength. Is there anything else that lends our particular situation to great entrepreneurship communities?
I think for myself, I think for a lot of rural communities, I've heard echoing those, these are our neighbors that we do work with, these are our family members, and some points are our children's parents that we work with. And so I think our ability to communicate on a professional level with that level of respect of where you're coming from and where I'm coming from, that, maybe that connection was first made, on a walk down the street, but we're respecting each other where we're coming from as professionals or as community members. I find that in our community here, it's a beautiful place. I grew up here, I raised my children here. I don't ask for favors, but I know that there are communication lines that are open when they're given with that sort of respect. And when that respect is given, then folks really want to work with you and they want to help support their community. So I think that sort of networking that can happen in rural communities is unique to a small community where, they want to work, they want to have success in their town, they want to have, in Keene, we have a beautiful, dance and movement theater right across the street, we have a new ice arena, we have YMCA. This is all built around, what do you want to see in your town? What makes it quality of life that people want to move to? And once that setting is set, then people, will flock to a town like this.
Yeah, I think going with that, sorry, this is what you were going to say, but working for government, I think people see you differently when they know you, and in small towns, that seems to be the case more often than not. My dad is also a lifelong Muskegon resident, and his dad is a longtime Muskegon resident, so I'm known by association, and I think that breaks down some of the barriers that people might have otherwise with somebody that works in the local government. And just to add another point would be definitely proximity. I think you see it here in Keene. It's very well illustrated that everybody is just close to each other. I think people think rural, they think spread out, spacious farmland, things like that, but that's not always the case. There's tons and tons of small towns all over the world, and I think that in a lot of ways they're not too different than some of the biggest cities in the world, just in terms of the strengths they come with proximity and being near one another.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say. But, to add on to that, when I left economic development in July, I was in the grocery store one day and this lady came up to me and I know her and she said, so what kind of benefits does the school have? And I said, I don't really know, but probably the principal or one of the teachers could tell you. And she said, well, you worked at her all this time. And I realized she didn't know I worked in the courthouse. I had seen her a lot of times and we worked on different things, so she didn't really know where my office was. And so I think a lot of times we're also interrelated on things that we do in small communities. We know everybody. It's not like, I have kids that live in bigger cities and they talk about having to get an audience with the mayor or, having to get in somewhere to find something out. It's not that way. You're going to see that person in the church or in a grocery store or at a ball game or something. And you can build those relationships outside of your 9 to 5 job. And you have, it just works better that way. Just a little more relaxed when you go to them. It's kind of like when I used to, when I go to something in Topeka, at the state capitol, and my board of county commissioners would say, is that really a necessary expense? It's 5 hours this way or that way. And it's like, if they don't know we're here, it doesn't bother them when they do something that hurts us. They need to realize they put a face and a name with the action that they're taking. And it's the same way in a small town. It's really hard to do something that's going to negatively impact someone you love or someone you like in the community.
So let's talk about the things we don't like about being in some rural locations relative to the larger urban centers. I use this statistic a lot of times when I'm talking to people thinking about philanthropy and how to make the world better. the entire philanthropic sector, the last Giving USA report, about 90 billion was given out by just kind of US foundations. This, well in excess of that was given for this attraction-based economic development strategy in the form of tax subsidies. And we talked about that in the last conversation. But when you think about the scale of that, often philanthropy is really visible in our communities, and we think about people doing good. And yet the amount of resources put towards that is so relatively small to what else is out there. So in rural communities, we want to think about the gaps, what's not being funded, what's maybe being ignored, these pockets of need that we have that we could rise, shine a light on and raise the level of attention to. So let's talk about some of your gaps and things you're experiencing, and maybe we can hear from the audience too.
Yeah, I think funding is a huge thing for sure. We are lucky in Muskegon to have been, we still are the largest city on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, but very much a small town. And the reason we're that large is because we've had so much industry in recent years. It's closed for the most part, but we have a lot of the legacy benefits that come with that. So we have a world-class art museum, and we have a lot of private funders that will get involved when they need to. They're involved in the community and they're still there, even if the business isn't there. And one of the things we turned to more recently, and it goes back to the strength of a small town, is crowdfunding. And we talked earlier on about patronicity and how we use that to fund public art projects. So we have seed money from some of those larger businesses that used to exist, and then we fill those gaps in funding through crowdsourcing the effort. The same goes for small retail spaces. We run into that issue a lot. I feel like I've told this story somewhat piecemeal through all this, but that same mall that I described was completely torn down in the early 2000s, and we were left with basically a sandbox of a downtown. There were a handful of buildings that still stood, but they were literally just a huge expanse of sand. So we started from the beginning all over again, and slowly building up our downtown through the years. And because of that, we don't have those old small buildings with all the charm that you might find in a lot of small cities. We had nothing to begin with, and we've been trying to fill those gaps for small business owners to go where the overhead is not too much for them, but where they can still have a front door that's their home front door. And that was the idea behind the chalets. That's the idea behind a lot of the continuing work that we do in the city.
Some of the negative, I think we're our own worst enemy, at least in the community I've been involved in. When you want to do something or someone says, hey, this is an amenity that we need, and then you get the pushback of, we're not Kansas City, or we're not even Dodge City, It's like, no, we can have what we want. We can have this here. I think if we get past that helps us a lot. We can be whatever we want to be. No one's stopping us, and no one's coming to save us either. We have to do that ourselves as well. As far as the gaps, I feel really lucky. We're actually blessed that we have Network Kansas there, because they have provided funding and programming in so many different ways that we've been able to fill those gaps. And so funding is not, I would say that funding is not our biggest issue. It's probably deciding what we want to be and just going ahead and doing it. Here's a quick example. We've not had a salon in town. We've had a couple different ladies that do hairstyling, but not as far as nails and things like that. And we've been working hard to fill some of our Main Street businesses, so there wasn't a Main Street business, a brick and mortar available. So a young woman in our community last year got a little vintage, like a 1954, one of the little Can-Ham trailers, they had the wings on them. I can't remember what they're called. Sky Sparrow. What's that? Sky Sparrow, maybe? Kind of something like that, yeah. And started a nail salon in it. And it is the cutest nail salon you'll ever see. I think at the time she was 20 years old, and it's been going, since spring. That's huge. It's a job for her. It keeps our people in the area that want your nails done. You don't have to drive, 30, 60 miles. If there's room for one person in there, we make appointments and we pull up, and I just think there's so many things like that, kind of like your businesses like that we can do for ourselves. We don't have to wait for the traditional way for it to happen.
I was thinking about the the nonprofit arm of my business, which does has a mission of, just basically promoting underrepresented voices, which by nature is not popular music, and it requires some grant writing and some foundation support. And in our community, which is strong and full of really powerful nonprofits, there are only so many donors that are out there that have real money to put around. And even on New Hampshire-wide, there's a handful of New Hampshire organizations that are funding. So I've been on boards of different nonprofits at the same time that are competing for the same money from the same charitable foundation in our state. And I think one of the problems in a small state, in a small city, is that sometimes we're pitted against each other or have to kind of coordinate our timing on when we're fundraising and not to step on each other's toes. So I say that's a unique disadvantage of a small community.
Yeah, I mean, so we've got about 15 minutes left or so, and I'd love to kind of open things up to folks online, to folks in the room, to bring up any of the points that we just covered, either share a story or ask a question of the panelists. We'd love to hear from you, and if you need a minute to think about that, I'd love to hear from somebody from the audience. And so again, you are exploring things of trust building, unique strengths, gaps, things that we might be missing. Sure, go ahead. If you want to, maybe for the audience, they can't see you, but you can at least state your name and I'll repeat it for them.
Okay. So my name is Todd Warner.
Hi, Todd Warner.
And I guess my question is for Jamie, and I should just mention that I was supposed to pick Jamie up at the train station yesterday. Something else come up, but luckily someone else in the Radical World team was able to swoop in and bring the trip to us today. So nice to meet you, Jamie. And I guess my question or my request is just to paint a little bit more of a picture of the Western market, because this is why I was interested in Jamie joining us here today. I heard about this through a national organization, Strong Towns. Muskegon was voted the strongest town in America in what was 2018, Jamie? Yeah, so, and for planning and community development types, that's like an Oscar award. So, I guess, so I just would be curious to hear a little bit more about the germination of that idea, like how it got started. And it's not a radical idea, it's, like you said, essentially a bunch of garden sheds on an empty lot. But anytime someone has an idea that's slightly out of the box, there's always plenty of people who can say no along the way. So for me, it's a small miracle, even though it was a small project, which was a budget. I think it was a big win. So just to hear a little bit more about how that got off the ground.
Did you pay him for that? No. Go ahead, please paint that picture. We realize we probably should have had photos of it because it sounds amazing. But
No, it was a great segue though. So yeah, it was 2017, late 2017, and we had, like I said, been stuck with a ton of vacant lots in our downtown, specifically along our Main Street, Western Avenue, and we needed to do something with them. We, for a long time, were known as the beer tent capital of the world, so we had a lot of beer tents and outdoor parties and festivals, and we're really good at special events, but we had nothing that was more permanent down there. And what we didn't know that we did have was in the early stages of sort of a restaurant district on one end of a vacant lot, and the second largest farmers market in the state of Michigan on the other end of that vacant lot. And we had nothing to bridge the two. So I guess that the farmers market was a great example. It's over 100 years old, and it's massive, very popular, holds a ton of people downtown, but we couldn't get for cross-pollination of those two areas. And we looked at this vacant lot and thought we just need storefronts, but to our point about funding earlier, there was no way to physically build a store. So we started looking into options, and I had actually been to a few different cities where I had seen Christmas markets, winter markets, where they would do similar things like that, oftentimes in larger cities. So we looked into a few of those. I visited a few just on my own, and we decided to go that route. And we wound up custom building a lot of them early on because we had a specific look in mind. We wanted it to look as far from a collection of garden sheds as we could. A lot of that was driven by like online comment sections, which are terrible places most of the time, and this was no exception. So we did our best to make sort of a cohesive whole. We named it. We had called them sheds to start. The first article got us on flack, so we renamed them chalets. And we lined them along the sidewalk, 12 of them to start. The second year, we were up to 17 of them. We had no idea if we were going to be able to build 12 of them to start with. We did somehow, and I think every business except for one of them made it through that first season. They were wildly popular, especially popular on the busiest day of the farmers markets, which is our Saturdays. And we have gotten applicants to fill all of them every year since then. We're into our 5th or 6th year at this point, I want to say. They all kind of blend together. We've seen various amounts of turnover, but yeah, to the winning the strongest talent contest, Chuck Morone came to our town, and he pointed to that as something that, and I'm just paraphrasing what he said here, but something that a lot of places would think is below them, but one that unlocked the potential for small business ecosystem that didn't exist before. That went away with the whole downtown nearly 50 years prior. So it's sort of the first step, and we're in the process of trying to figure out what the next step looks like now.
And did you raise the money for that on Patronicity? I think you mentioned them before.
Not that one. We actually worked with our Chamber of Commerce through a lot of private funding. They pitched in. Our community foundation is very strong, and we were able to gather the money needed for that too. And we're lenient and have been lenient since about things that people build on our vacant lots in our downtown. We've been trying to just bring activity to a place that had literally nothing. Even 10 years ago, there was almost nothing.
We have a question back here.
This is actually for Jeff. Hi, I'm Sarah Powell, Program Director at Enterprise, and I live here in this area. But Jeff, I'd love for the audience to hear a little bit more about your business model. You moved into new space and sort of been part of Brew Bakers to kind of have these different layers, but you also provide sort of the mini ecosystem within your business for other businesses. And I think that that's really special and it adds a lot of value to our community and I'm sure to your business. So if you could just talk a little bit about the evolution of that and how that works for you and just in general, like why you sort of do that.
Thank you. So it's a long story, but I'll try to paraphrase it a little bit. So in 2011, my wife and I bought Brew Bakers Cafe, which was a hub on Main Street that had been around since the early 90s. Rewind 5 years before that, we had twin baby boys. After a couple of years, my wife was like, I just need to go out and see adults. So she started working as a barista. We got really involved. I was in school for business. We found out that the business was for sale, so we kind of dovetailed my business planning my senior project into the purchase of the business. First year was wild and woolly and fun. A year later, our coffee supplier said, hey, I'm trying to get out of this. Okay. Part of our 5-year plan, we rolled into our 1-year plan. We built a coffee roastery in our barn out in Surrey, in a rural town near here. We operated that roastery for 7 years. We were shipping coffee all over the place out of a tiny little barn. And it was really, really beautiful community space on a small scale with about 33 seats in there. We were talking about politics earlier, where just pulled out a picture of Barack Obama at our counter and Hillary Clinton. And it's just been an amazing experience. Fast forward to 2017, we decided to move into town with our family. We built another roastery in the back of an old health food store in town. So that was kind of closer. We started doing concerts at a grassroots DIY level, kind of don't ask, don't tell, in a garage space. It was a lot of fun. We have a bakery market in the roastery. It was really, really a fun experience. And in 2019, our Main Street Cafe was renting from the local theater, the Colonial Theater, which most of you have probably been to, which was a wonderful partnership for many years. And they were going through some renovations themselves, and so they let us know that we wouldn't be able to be there anymore. So we took the summer, looked all up and down Main Street, kind of settled back on our building on Emerald Street where the grocery was. We spent 3 or 4 months negotiating with the antique store that we've been sharing the space with the building owner, working with their local architect, yada, yada, yada. February rolled around, we signed the paperwork for the project management contract and for our super long lease, and a week later, the world shut down, the pandemic. So we had to pivot pretty fast. We kept our online grocery business going. Time worked out, kept our core of that time was 10 full-time employees, now we have 27. Kept them on as part of the strategic planning, sectioned off most of the buildings, about 6,000 square feet that we occupied, operated a local aggregate food market where people can pick up bread, coffee, flowers with local vendors, just kind of keep everyone afloat, keep them active while we finished our whole huge project, reopened October 2020 in an optimized space. So since then we've had hundreds of events, and really wanted, when we moved, we knew we wanted to have a community space, because I think that space, when created, as you're saying, allows the community to come in and for sort of magic to happen.
All right, do we have any other questions, or maybe brag moment, if you've got something amazing that you've done in your community that you'd like to shout out?
So I'm sort of curious, I mean, I suppose for all of you, but it sounds like you had this idea for how to do a thing in your downtown area. How was it decided?
Sort of, and it goes back to the panel that was up here before. How was it determined that this was the way forward, that this was the best way forward for your community? And was there actually opportunities, like, I don't know, surveys or conversations or something for people in the community to provide feedback before action happened?
Yeah, there definitely was. And there, I guess you could trace it back to, I think it was 2003 when we demolished the mall that was there. And there was a massive public engagement, really just grassroots engagement. It wasn't implemented by the city at the time or anything, but they created a plan that was called the Imagine Stephen Plan that pretty much looked at the footprint of the former mall and said, what do we want this to be? Because everybody knew that that was the former heart of downtown, the heart of the entire city, and we now had nothing. We had to take control of the direction we wanted to go. So a lot of effort was put into that at the grassroots level, and that sort of parlayed into a few much later decisions. It wasn't sort of instantaneous, so there was a lot of time to just think about this and look at all these vacant lots. Just before I actually started with the city, we adopted a form-based code in our downtown, so we were trying to break down sort of the regulatory barriers that existed, a lot of outdated zoning ordinances, things like that. And we still weren't seeing the development that we wanted. We were coming out of the recession. We had seen a couple buildings built just prior to that, but really nothing after that took hold. And just at a certain point, you look at these vacant lots in the middle of your downtown for long enough to where you know that there's got to be something there to kickstart things. And prior to that, we had no offers on the land. And since we put these chalets in, we've had a handful of offers. None of them have come to fruition, not so much because the projects fell through, but because we're trying to figure out the best way to keep what we put there relevant. They all can be picked up and moved, but everybody knows that that spot is so key to what's happening in downtown city, that we are almost hesitant to move them to a new location. We know that we created a good place there, and in a lot of ways, I think to your point about whether or not we've had public engagement to see what these look like, we kind of just went for it. Like I said, it was late 2017, and by spring of 2018, the start of our farmers market season, they were open. And I know that wasn't always the most popular decision, but just think if we hadn't done that, if we decided we were going to do more public engagement after the 10 years prior of just talking about what we could do in downtown. Sometimes I think, and our former city manager was a huge component of this, you just have to ask and see what happens.
And another thing I would add to it is that unless there's something that just absolutely says you can't do something, I'd go ahead and do it. It's so much easier to ask forgiveness later, honestly. And if you, even if you've done it and then you get in trouble, if it was over good, maybe they'll change the rules for you. And it generally works that way.
Yeah, I mean, I want to take a minute before we close to first of all thank you, Bree. I mean, what you're each doing seems superhuman to me. You're probably doing 5 jobs in one. So I want to close on the theme of sustainability of what we do and to encourage everyone here. A lot of us who do this work, we can burn out because you're doing a lot. You're doing a lot of care work, organizing work. You're literally on your feet. Doing these things physically, hosting a lot of events. So if there's any, last thoughts you have on how you stay balanced in what you do and how do you keep the energy high so that you can keep going?
I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our city clerk because Anne is the one that really oversees a lot of the day-to-day operations of the chalet. She couldn't be here, but she passed this opportunity on to me, and I just wanted to give her credit for all the hard work she's done as well. Her job is to run elections, but you never know based on the number of different hats she wears.
So you'll go home and ask this question again, right? Yeah, okay, good. You take care of her.
My words of wisdom would be to build a team that you trust and trust them to do their jobs, and also just take time to enjoy what you build. Taking that breath, to watch it all work, to watch the magic now of systems working. It's a beautiful thing, and I think if you don't take those times, then you will burn out because you don't have that positive input coming in.
Wish I had something profound to say, but don't be afraid to do stupid things. Because, about half of what you do doesn't stick. And so you just move on to the next thing, and maybe it will, and maybe it won't, and then you move on to the next thing. And that's the only way to find out what does work. And then I would say a lot of caffeinated conversations. If that doesn't get you where you want, maybe, Hemingway did his best work when he was drinking. And so if coffee doesn't do it, maybe wine will.
So we're going to leave you on the wisdom of coffee and beer and scientifically proven to enhance entrepreneurship. And so I will also give a plug to stay and do some work with us. The workshop at 3:30 will be here in this room. It's going to be fully interactive, so you get to use your brain. It will not be a sleepy afternoon thing. And it's been thought of by some great minds who do incredible work, so I encourage you to stay and work with us on that. And thank you. Thank you.
So we'll need to do a little room reset, so folks can maybe get some fresh air for a couple minutes. It's nice to meet you too. I've been chased each other on Zoom and been emailed.